I am going to discuss from the 1960s up to around the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is about when I guess the Cold War starts to come to an end. So I'll kind of talk about how the Berlin Wall collapsed, in Germany, and then you get the breakup of the Soviet Union. I'll spend a few minutes today also maybe talking about major events that also happened after the Cold War ended as well. So if you have any comments, questions during the, live stream, let me know, or you can always, leave me comments, questions later on my channel. You can also subscribe to my channel as well, of course. So this is our last lecture, like I said, for, the spring semester 2022. So yeah, one of the things I'm going to talk a lot about today, of course, a major event that happened, at the, I guess, kind of in the peak of the Cold War was the Vietnam War conflict, that happened, of course, in Southeast Asia. This is, of course, a major event that pulled the United States into it. Also, the French were involved in it as well. The Vietnam War is one of those proxy wars, in the Cold War era, kind of like the Korean War was, of course, in the early 1950s. You had basically pro-capitalist, Western type forces that fought against communist forces, of course, in Southeast Asia, which were backed by the Soviet Union and also the Chinese. And part of why the conflict started was because of the fact that Japan had taken over Southeast Asia, during World War II, but they withdrew. And so that kind of left kind of a conflict after that. And you had like really two main conflicts that really happened in Vietnam, starting in the around 1945 up to about 1975. The first one was called the First Indochina War, which kind of gets started right after the Japanese withdrawal, of course, from Indochina at the time. And kind of show you a picture right here, but I'll get the Dien Bien Phu later, which is kind of one of the most famous battles associated with that. The French wanted revenge because of the fact that they had been humiliated by Germany and Japan, in World War II. And so I think this later happens, especially under, the French. They want to go in there and, take back their empire, which I guess went back to the time of Napoleon III. And so you get this attempt by the French to come back in and take over Indochina again. The only thing was the Vietnamese were led by this man named Ho Chi Minh. I'll kind of blow him up right here. Ho Chi Minh, which is right there. His real name was actually Nguyen Sin Kung. I think they kind of mentioned that in the short little video we watched at the beginning. And he was this Vietnamese communist revolutionary that, by the way, went all the way back to World War I. He was actually at the Paris Peace Conference, if you know about that, in Paris in 1919, was talking about this idea of Vietnamese independence. And so people didn't want to listen to him and all that. And for many, many years, Ho Chi Minh was, in exile. He was not living in I think Vietnam until I think he came back like in the 1940s and all that. And so you got this deal where the French want to restore, French Indochina and their empire, in Southeast Asia. And then Ho Chi Minh, who wants to, spread, this idea of Vietnamese independence to have, a nationalized independent country of the Vietnamese. That's what kind of led to the conflict, of course, occurring later. Ho Chi Minh, by the way, led this thing called the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh was a Vietnamese nationalist movement. It was also like a military force that also fought against like the French, I guess later the American forces that would be there later. And they were involved in trying to unify, Vietnam and at least fight off the French at that point. And in 1945, what happened was the Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh declared itself an independent state, which became known later as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which later is known as North Vietnam is what they actually called it. And Ho Chi Minh became its first president in 1945. He'll be president from 1945 to, I think, 1969 when he died during the Vietnam conflict. So he's president of North Vietnam for over 20-something years overall. They did have famous generals, like you may have heard of Vo Nguyen Giap. He was kind of well known, of course, in the conflict. He led the Viet Minh forces and later would be the North Vietnamese Army. It's got different names that they call it, but he's really considered to be one of the greatest military strategists of the 20th century. Some people call him the so-called Red Napoleon. That's what they dubbed it. And this man was not really even like trained as a military man. Like he never went to any military schools or anything like that. In fact, he was actually, I think, mostly a military historian, was what he was originally. But he read a lot of books, about military history, and so he would later end up being, the head of their main armies during the war, which had different names. They called it PAVN, or People's Army of Vietnam, but I think that in the South, and the Americans later called it the NVA, North Vietnamese Army, is what they called it later. But he was a military genius overall. The French, of course, don't fare well. If you know much about the First Indochina War, the Viet Minh eventually would defeat them by 1954, so-called Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which was fought up in the northern part of Vietnam today, kind of in the western part of it, of northwestern Vietnam. Today is where it was fought. Very isolated part of the region west of Hanoi, which was later the capital of North Vietnam. And the French forces were eventually surrounded by the Viet Minh, and they're eventually forced to surrender their forces. So it was a total humiliation. What happened at Dien Bien Phu, and so the French at that point decided to get out. They basically get out of Vietnam and withdraw their forces. That's going to later lead to, of course, the United States, of course, entering the war, of course, later because of that. What ends up happening is they have this thing that's called the 1954 Geneva Conference. What it does, it divides Vietnam in half at what they call the 17th parallel, kind of like what happened with Korea. If you remember when Korea was divided in the 38th parallel, kind of similar to that, but at the 17th parallel. It also created Cambodia and Laos, which those two countries were kingdoms that they had, and then the other two were Republican states that were created that you have. You can see Republic of Vietnam on the left there, which was in the south. You can see the flag that they had. They were backed by the United States, and their capital was Saigon, which is now today called Ho Chi Minh City. Then the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, of course, was in the north. It basically was considered a communist state or a Marxist-Leninist state at the time. Its capital, of course, at Hanoi, and of course, President Ho Chi Minh, of course, of that particular state. By the way, also, if you study about the Republic of Vietnam, also, of course, South Vietnam, of course, is called later. It did have a president, which one of its first major presidents was Ngo Dinh Diem, of course, who was president from 1945 to 1963. He's, of course, backed up, by the United States, pretty much from, I guess, Truman's administration, really Eisenhower and also JFK, and then eventually up through, of course, Lyndon Baines Johnson's administration in the United States. Now they do have, of course, you can see here's kind of a map showing the differences between the different states there, by the way. So you got North Vietnam, which you see it's close to China, just right there. Laos, you can see, and Cambodia are kind of next to Thailand right there. And you can see where the 17th parallel is going through, of course, right there. I'll later talk about the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That's kind of important later in the war. It is a major reason, part of why the North Vietnamese would eventually defeat the United States in the South South Vietnamese military. That played a major role, of course, in why that happened. Now, of course, I'll get to it next. You have, of course, the United States, enters the Vietnam War. That's the next thing, of course, that happens, which we really start getting in the war under Eisenhower's administration. We kind of, after Dien Bien Phu, we start kind of sending military aid to South Vietnam. And a lot of it had to do with this belief with the whole domino theory. There was a theory that, if all the countries in Southeast Asia went communist, they would all go communist. And so there was a fear that North Vietnam would overwhelm South Vietnam. And so basically the United States started sending in military advisors to help out South Vietnam. And they were known as MAG, Military Assistance Advisory Group Vietnam. If you know about this, we first sent military advisors to help out the South Vietnamese Army, which they call ARVN, Army of Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And like the Green Berets, as they were later called under John F. Kennedy, they were sent in to help out, train a lot of the Vietnamese forces fighting, of course, North Vietnam, and also the Viet Cong, which I'll get to in a second as well. So they helped train a lot of their forces for really over like a 20-year period, And the Vietnam War was not a popular war. It was kind of like Korea was not popular either. That war was, people hated the Korean War. People wondered why we were fighting over there in Southeast Asia. It later led to mass protests where especially college students and young people that were in college and high school refused to serve in the military, things like that. And I think also all the different atrocities that were committed in the war and expansion of the war, like into Cambodia and Laos, also didn't help. And then bombing North Vietnam and things like that kind of made it unpopular. A lot of college students didn't want to get drafted either, which they hadn't done before. Like most people that got drafted before were mostly like high school type students or working class. That was one thing that was different about that. So yeah, it's under really these two presidents you see here. Yeah, Eisenhower started sending officials to, advisors to fight, of course, and help out, South Vietnam. And then Kennedy really expanded the amount of advisors, like into, I forget exactly the number, but it was like 15, 20,000 or more that were sent there at one point. And you even start getting Americans getting killed also as well, that are kind of not supposed to be there, but they are. Now, of course, what really got the United States involved was under Lyndon Johnson's administration. He's really the man that really kind of expands the war, starting around 1964, 1965. A lot of it was caused by this incident that happened, I'll get to later, which was called the Gulf of Tonkin incident that happened in August of 1964. Johnson was very anti-communist. He believed that they were trying to save South Vietnam from being overtaken by North Vietnam, aggression from the North. And so he wanted to help them out as much as possible. And the main incident that really got the United States involved was the Gulf of Tonkin incident that happened in 1964, where what happened was there was a deal where North Vietnamese gunboats were attacked what they think were American ships that were in the Gulf of Tonkin, which, believe it or not, we were spying on North Vietnam, was what really the United States was trying to do with these ships being in the Gulf of Tonkin. And it's believed that the USS Maddox was the actual ship that was attacked. where they shot like torpedoes at it and maybe machine gun fire. They're not sure that Turner Joy, though, was fired on. I think they think that was actually proved to be wrong later. But what it did was it led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was issued afterwards. And so that widened the war to escalation. But we never really officially declared war on North Vietnam. It became like a police action, if you know about that. And over the next several years, the U.S. would start sending in troops, of course, into South Vietnam, which would escalate over the next 5-6 years. Anyway, now the forces that we fought, of course, there's U.S. Marines that came ashore in 1965 at Da Nang. That's where like really the first troops really come in at that point. The United States would fight against two major forces really in Vietnam. We fought against, of course, the North Vietnamese army, like the regular army, which was also called, I think I told you, called PAVN as well. And then you also had the Viet Cong, which were Vietnamese communist guerrillas that were in South Vietnam, that were in support with the North Vietnamese. And those two were, backed by the Soviet Union and the Chinese. And the Viet Cong had another name. It was also officially called the National Liberation Front, or the NLF. They were often called Viet Cong for short, or they had other names that the Americans and South Vietnamese called them as well, which were VC, if you know about that. Or also they called them sometimes Victor Charlie or just Charlie. Those that were communist forces that were fighting against them and all that. And so that became their name. And the Viet Cong were pretty tenacious, of course, in the war, at least up to 1968, up to like the Tet Offensive, if you know about that. And then, of course, the Vietnam War was also known as the helicopter war sometimes, and the fact that the American and South Vietnamese forces, ARVN, used helicopters to get around the country because if you know about Vietnam, its terrain has a lot of mountains and jungle, and so it was easier to get forces to a point to attack the enemy a lot quicker using helicopters like those Hueys you see, which are famous. They also use different kinds of helicopter gunships, and of course, you also have the air war where they also bombed North Vietnam as well. Here's kind of a Huey right here with a combination of men. So a Huey, I think, could take up like 10, 12 men in it at a time. And you even get like the first air cav, if you know about that, that fought, in World War I, which used to be a cavalry. You used horses and all that. They started using helicopters, of course, instead. Of course, there was other controversies. You may have heard about Vietnam, which is well known. They also had this thing called Agent Orange. You may have heard about how the U.S. used these herbicides and defoliants to clear jungle to fight against the communist forces. And it did create a lot of health issues, I think, with soldiers that were exposed to it. So that's one thing that's kind of controversial, about the Vietnam War and all that. And so, yeah, they used that as well, of course, during the war. So, yeah, we fought along with ARVN forces, or the Republic of South Vietnam, but their forces weren't really not that good if you really study about it. Now, the peak of the war really came with what they call the Tet Offensive, which happened in 1968. This came at about the same time when the U.S. military forces really peaked in size. We got to like around 500,000 troops, of course, in South Vietnam. And the United States had a really difficult time trying to defeat the communist side because of the Ho Chi Minh Trail that they had. And you can kind of see a map right here. Anyway, you can see the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which went down from like North Vietnam. It ran down through Laos and Cambodia. And so it made it very difficult for us to stop that. We kept bombing it, if you know about that, during the war. We even sent forces into Laos and Cambodia to stop it. But in the end, it really was one of the key things that really led to why the North won later. And the Tet Offensive was launched in January of 1968. And of course, the worst battle, of course, if you know, for really with the whole Tet Offensive was the Battle of Hue, or Hue City, which happened between January to March. That was here like the bloodiest conflict, the whole thing. And at one point, the Viet Cong and some of the North Vietnamese took the actual city of Hue, which is kind of like in the central part of South Vietnam. And they had to retake it, basically. And I think it led to a bunch of atrocities where I think they talked about in the video how 6,000 civilians were actually massacred by the Viet Cong, of course. So that's really considered like the peak of the war, really. And they do think that the Battle of Hue, the Tet Offensive, they think it turned the war against the public, kind of started going against the war and all that. And mass protests really start taking off at that point under Lyndon B. Baines Johnson's administration. It's also going to help to later kill the draft, if you know about that. That's why the United States doesn't have the military draft anymore, is because of what happened with the Vietnam War. So that's one of the things that's kind of famous, I guess, about Vietnam. Oh, there was this incident where they executed this man named Nguyen Van Lim. You may have heard about this, which happened in the streets of Saigon, which I guess that kind of helped to kind of show how brutal the war was and all that. But he actually was this Viet Cong assassin that they caught, and they executed him on the spot. But actually you can actually watch video footage of it where they execute him and shoot him in the head. It's pretty awful. Here's other images, of course, of Vietnam, of course, right here. Of course, protests in the U.S., which a lot of students, like I said, like on college campuses, protested against the war and all that. Also, the war was known for atrocities, if you know about that. Of course, one of the most famous was the My Massacre, which happened in March of 1968, where some American soldiers massacred a whole Vietnamese village, like in South Vietnam, because they suspected them of either being collaborating with the Viet Cong or maybe supporters of the Viet Cong. And I guess a lot of Americans were getting frustrated in the war because they didn't know where their enemy was and all that. And if you know about the Vietnam War, there was no actual real, boundaries, whatever, in the war. Like the front lines were everywhere. You could be attacked anywhere at any time, and so that had a lot to do with it as well. Of course, the Vietnamese, here's kind of a timeline of the war. Later, one of the things that happens in 1968, Richard Nixon of California, who was a Republican, was elected president on this promise to end the war in Vietnam. He came up with this idea called Vietnamization, if you know about it, which was an idea to turn the Vietnam War over to the Republic of Vietnam in ARVN. They would train ARVN to fight North Vietnam and all that, and go it alone without them. And then they would start withdrawing forces. And so they had this thing called the Paris Peace Accords that took place in Paris, where eventually by 1973, the U.S. Decided to withdraw their forces. And we would do this over a period of like 3-4 years, really up to like 1975, 76. We kind of start withdrawing forces from Vietnam and all that. But Nixon would not be in power, as you know, of course, when we got out of Vietnam. That would be, of course, under President Gerald Ford, because Nixon, if you know about, had to resign because of the Watergate scandal. You know about that happened in the 1970s and all that. North Vietnam later broke the agreement, if you know about that was in the Paris Peace Accords. They eventually invaded South Vietnam after the United States had withdrawn their forces. which they had the so-called 1975 spring offensive, which I think lasted about close to 2 months. And what ended up happening was Saigon eventually fell, if you know about this, to Vietnam forces. Here's kind of the Kent State shootings, by the way. They actually had shootings on campuses because of all the protests, by the way, like at Kent State in Ohio. That's famous. But what happens, of course, if you know about it, is the Saigon fell in April. In fact, April 30th is the date when the North Vietnamese forces took the capital of Saigon. And so after that, if you know about what happened, the North Vietnamese would take Vietnam and they would reunify it as one state. So I think the common name they call it now is the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, which will be formed in 1976 afterwards. So basically, Vietnam unifies afterwards. And the whole Vietnam War, if you know about it, was a total failure to the United States. We pretty much lost the war. And a lot of South Vietnamese, if you know about it, fled the country. They left either with the United States or you also had the so-called Vietnamese boat people that left on boats, if you know about that afterwards. And a lot of the South Vietnamese still call the fall of Saigon, which happened on April 30th, 1975. They still call it Black April, if you know about that. There's even a book like that I read a while back. It's pretty good about it, about the end of Vietnam. The war, by the way, had a lot of casualties. I think up to like 3 million deaths may have actually occurred going back to like the 1940s. So it was a pretty bloody conflict, the Vietnam War. The United States almost had 60,000 people killed in the war, wounded maybe 150,000. ARVN's forces, or Republic of Vietnam or South Vietnam, 1.3 million casualties. They think the NBA and Viet Cong, 1.5 million casualties. So they think the casualties may have been close to that amount. It's kind of a debate about that. I think 2 to 3 million is usually the amount that they usually talk about, usually. So here's kind of a picture, of course, 1975 when we evacuated the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. And of course, Saigon today now is called Ho Chi Minh City, of course, named after the former president, Ho Chi Minh. There, of course, the very famous, that's I think it was the palace where the president of South Vietnam was in Saigon, where that tank kind of crashes through there on April 30th, 1975. That's a famous picture, of course, showing the end of the Vietnam War and all that. Now, I'm going to get next, and I'm going to kind of talk about the end of the Cold War. Of course, some of the things that happened, of course, were kind of famous as well. If you talk about the 1970s, there's a period that they call around that time. It's called Detente. You may have heard about this. And there was a deal where there was an easing of tensions that occurred between the United States and the Soviet Union. There was an attempt also to try to prevent, I guess, World War III from possibly still breaking out between both sides, in the Cold War era. And détente was a French term, by the way, that was kind of, I think, been used before. I want to say going back to, the 19th century. It's a relaxation of strained relations or tensions between nations. That would be a definition of what it basically is. They do think it was heavily influenced by Richard Nixon. He was president of the United States at the time. I'll kind of go through some different topics that, kind of occur. There's Nixon right there meeting with the Soviet leader at the time, which I'll get to later, which is Leonid Brezhnev. And they do think that Nixon's foreign policies, a lot of it was influenced by Henry Kissinger. If you know about this, who was the Secretary of State in the late 60s and early 70s. He's kind of famous at that time. And Kissinger is the one that helped organize a lot of Nixon trips to China and also the Soviet Union. If you know about this, in 1972, February, the winter, Nixon went to China, which is kind of important because it helped open up China a lot afterwards. And so that's part of why, China and the U.S. become closer later and began trading with each other and all that. And also, Nixon also went to the Soviet Union as well to meet with the leader of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev. That was the so-called Moscow Summit, or I think sometimes called Moscow Summit 1, because there was like two of these they had, basically. And detente was kind of important because it helped to not only lead to trade between, say, U.S. and Soviet Union. We began trading back and forth and all that, but it also led to a limit on like nuclear weapons, like nuclear missiles, various ballistic missiles as well. And so that's kind of important with that. Here's an image, of course, of Nixon in China meeting with Mao Zedong, who we've talked about before, who, of course, the founder of the People's Republic of China. So there's a meeting with him there. It's also a famous image, of course, Nixon at the Great Wall, of course, in China as well, with his wife, Pat. You see on the right in the red coat. So that's kind of an important thing, that kind of opening up, leading to detente at that point overall. They also had the Moscow Summit I was talking about in 1972. Had that. There's, of course, Leonid Brezhnev on the right, of course, with Nixon. They do think that that was important, the Moscow Summit, because it did lead to, believe it or not, Brezhnev then came to the United States in 1973. There, you can see him there on that image on the left, meeting with Nixon in the White House, of course. And that'll be kind of important because it later leads to important things that occur afterwards. Like they have the so-called ABM treaty that followed in 1972, which was really one of the first arms control agreements made between, United States and the Soviet Union, where they limited the number of surface-to-air missiles, of course, of both nations, which could use, against nuclear weapons and things like that. And I think that was also because of the Vietnam War also going on too at the same time as well. Later, that led to what they call SALT, if you know too, SALT, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which were important and leading to what they call START. If you know what START is, START stands for Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties, which began to be created really in the 1980s and into the 1990s, and even up to the time of the Obama administration as well. START 1, 2, 3. They also had New START, which I think came out in 2012 under President Obama. And these are all the main presidents I know that they had that was under. But if you study about what they call START, it later led to the limitations on the amount of nuclear weapons that you could have. So both nations could deploy more than 6,000. That's the most they could do, 6,000 nuclear warheads, but with a total of 1,600 intercontinental ballistic missiles. I think it's kind of similar to that still today of what's limited. And that's, I think, combined, I believe that was what it was overall. But that's something that kind of came out of this whole thing that Nixon kind of started in the early 1970s. He was actually a pretty good president, Nixon, I think. But if you know about it, he would have almost been impeached because of the whole Watergate thing. So as Leonid Brezhnev, of course, who you're looking at right there. Brezhnev, by the way, was the second longest reigning Soviet leader behind Joseph Stalin, who I think almost reigned 30 years. So he was in power close to like 18 years at one point. They do sometimes talk about the fact that he kind of did try to, prevent the spread of like democracy throughout like Eastern Europe. That's one thing he did try to do. I'll kind of talk about today a little bit. They also talk about the fact that under him, Soviet Union started to decline, though. I think 70s was the peak. They start having this economic stagnation that happens, the so-called Brezhnev stagnation, which I think a lot of it was because of what happened with the oil crisis. I'll get to later because the price of oil went up and all that. But economically, the Soviet Union began to decline, and they couldn't compete with the United States later, and so that had a lot to do with why of course, that happened. the Soviets had this thing called the Brezhnev Doctrine, if you know about it. And this was a doctrine that Brezhnev pushed, of course, when he was in power. And it was this idea to intervene or prevent communist states, like the Warsaw Pact states and all that in Eastern Europe, from going democratic or capitalist and all that. And so this was a big part of their foreign policy. It also led to the, about this, the intervention in Afghanistan and all that as well. And what happened was in 1968, you have what they call the Prague Spring happen, where from about January to August, the Czech people revolted against the Soviet system. They wanted democracy, they wanted liberalization in Czechoslovakia. And so at one point they threw out the Soviet forces. And so Brezhnev decided to intervene. You study about it, they had this ruler they had that was named Alexander Dubček. He was actually the one that instigated a lot of the reforms in the country. And so what happened was the Soviets, with some of the Eastern European bloc countries, they decided to intervene. And so in August of 1968, USSR, Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria invaded Czechoslovakia, and they prevented the reforms at that point. So they basically crushed this whole Prague Spring thing. And they do think that this invasion was one thing that kind of helped to cause a lot of conflict later. They think that's part of one of the conflicts that would later lead to why communism would fall in Eastern Europe and why the Soviet Union would collapse, because people realized that the Soviets were against these ideas, these liberal ideas, democracy, and things like that. And ultimately, it's going to later lead to the revolutions of 1989 that will pretty much, destroy all that. Of course, the other thing that happened that they think led to why the Soviet Union declined later, of course, was because of the fact that in 1979, the Soviets decided to intervene in Afghanistan to support the government there that was kind of pro-communist. And it created this big guerrilla war that would last something like 10 years. The Soviet-Afghan wars, they would call it, was kind of like the Soviet Union's Vietnam, and kind of contribute to why, the Soviet Union would decline and all that. And so the United States, if you know about, I'll get to it later, would support a lot of the various, Afghan rebels, like the Mujahideen and all that are fighting there, like Osama bin Laden. And so that's why we got involved with that too, as well. Then in the 70s, they had the oil glut or oil crisis, I guess it happened. That was kind of big. There were actually two oil crises that happened in 1973 and 1979 that happened mostly under Nixon, Gerald Ford's administration, and under also Jimmy Carter as well, presidents of the United States. And if you know about the 1970s, it was a period of stagflation, which was a deal where a lot of world economies were suffering from not just massive inflation, but also because of economic stagnation as well. Unemployment was kind of high. And something we're kind of familiar with, I'm familiar with, because I was kind of born in the early 70s and all that. And kind of like now, with inflation going on now, I'm thinking it could lead to that if the oil prices keep going up and all that. But they do think that a lot of it was caused by the Arab-Israeli wars, which went back to like the 1950s, in the 1960s. And what really caused it was the fact that the United States began to openly support Israel, the state of Israel, by the early 1970s under the Nixon administration. And so it led to OPEC, about this, the Arab states that produce oil. They basically put an oil embargo on the United States and Western nations. That led to the price of oil and gas going up. I think it went up like 400% or something like that, which was really high. And one of the first wars where, state of Israel had a pretty good military, which defeated a lot of the Arab forces going back to like the 6 Day War in June 1967, where they defeated like Egypt and Syria, etc. And what happened was Egypt and Syria retaliated against Israel in 1973. It looked like the Israelis were going to lose the war. And so the United States under Nixon and Kissinger decided to openly support the state of Israel, which we've done since then, since 1973. And so that led to why, the whole thing happened with the oil crisis later. And so a lot of the Arab countries refused to sell to the West for a while, sell their oil and all that. Also, other instances I kind of mentioned about, they're kind of famous, I guess, in the Middle East. They had the Iranian Revolution. You may have heard about that. That happened in 1979. They had that occur, and also the Iran hostage crisis that occurred. And what happened was Islamic peoples took over, basically, like radical Islam took over Iran at that point. And they were led by this man named Ayatollah Khomeini. And that's really the beginning of why you get radical Islam throughout the Middle East afterwards with the Iranian Revolution. And they were anti-American, if you know about this. And they of course, were supported by like the Soviet Union, etc. This happened under Jimmy Carter's administration, who was president from 1977 to 1981. And Carter fared badly in this whole issue with the Iranian Revolution. And of course, what happened was they had a case where Americans, like the U.S. embassy, was taken by the Iranians, and they held them for like 444 days from 1979 to 1981. It was a big crisis, I think we studied about this, and it later led to why Ronald Reagan came in, was elected president in 1990. And that's the important thing, really, at the end of the Cold War, if you know about it, was that Ronald Reagan and a lot of his policies, that had a lot to do with, they say, about why, the Cold War ended by I guess the early 1990s. And Reagan was the one that called the Soviet Union, if you know about this, the evil empire. He thought it had to be, taken apart or ended. And Reagan had this policy he kind of developed, which was called the Reagan Doctrine. And this doctrine was this policy where the United States began to support any kind of guerrillas throughout the world, or resistance movements that were anti-communist and all that. And so he starts doing that, if you know about this, in Afghanistan, also in like Central America, if you know about that. Like the Iran-Contra thing, I know it was kind of controversial later and all that. I know the big thing was them supporting, like, I'll get to it now, but you had this whole deal with the Afghan rebels, like the Mujahideen. I know it's one of the biggest things where we supported them against the Soviet forces. And we, of course, supported Osama bin Laden, who was part of the Mujahideen overall, who later was involved in 9/11 with the September 11 attacks and all that, Osama bin Laden. And so that's something that was kind of famous, I guess, that Reagan helped to do to help end the Cold War by, antagonizing the Soviet forces in Afghanistan and all that. Of course, they do talk about the whole thing that Reagan was famous for, which was the Star Wars program, or SDI, which stood for short Strategic Defense Initiative. It was this idea to create like a nuclear umbrella to prevent nuclear war, where we would use satellites in space to destroy any kind of nuclear missiles shot at us from the Soviet Union. So it was a missile defense system that was kind of an idea that Reagan came up with around 1983, 84. And it was one of the things that helped to defeat the Soviets in the war, because the Soviets then had to spend a lot of money to keep up with us militarily, which they think eventually bankrupted them, about that. Then they had, of course, this deal where Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, if you know about that. He was really one of the last leaders of the Soviet Union. He was first premier in 1985 and a later president. He was like the only president of the Soviet Union, if you know about this. And a lot of the policies of Gorbachev, they think, helped to really end the Cold War because of the fact that he came up with these new policies to create more openness in the country, which the two big liberal forms they always talk about with Gorbachev was the whole thing with glasnost, which means openness, and then perestroika, which meant restructuring. And both those were ideas to, change the Soviet Union to be more capitalistic. What they kind of wanted to do with perestroika. And glasnost was the idea to create more freedoms in the country, things like that, freedom of speech and et cetera and all that, and to make I guess the Soviet Union more like the West more overall. Of course, Reagan became famous for his Berlin Wall speech. I think that was another thing that kind of helped also to end really the whole Cold War era as well. When Reagan went to West Germany near the Brandenburg Gate and gave a speech about that. And I'll kind of show you a little short video, of course, on that.
Many conservatives thought that Reagan had been charmed by Gorbachev, and Reagan actually had more problem dealing with his hard right than he did the left. So Reagan had to constantly let the right know, I know what I'm doing.
Reagan was being accused already of getting soft on communism, but he hadn't forgotten the problems we still had. Europe is still divided. There was still a Berlin Wall.
There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
It was perfect. It was beautiful. And he had to insist on keeping it in the speech. And he did it. Don't let anybody tell you it was a staffer or anybody else that did that.
Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev decides to do something bold. And he says, let's separate SDI from reducing the nuclear stockpile. Once he does this, it opens up the possibility for a third summit.
Yeah, that speech was pretty defining, of course, in the Cold War era. And I think a lot of it has a lot to do with why the Cold War ended, of course, later. Now, I'll also talk about, of course, the other big thing that happened, too, at the end of the Cold War. Really, the most important thing was the revolutions of 1989 that occurred. And that's really the fall of communism. That's kind of one of the nicknames they dub it. And there was a series of revolutions that rocked Eastern Europe starting around 1989. They think that a lot of it was started by Poland, believe it or not. They have this thing called the Solidarity Movement you may have heard about. It started in the 1980s, which was led by Lech Walesa, who later was president of Poland after the Cold War ended. And it was like this trade union that became well known in Poland. And a lot of the democratic change that were kind of starting in Poland then spread to other countries, throughout Europe at that point. And so the revolution of 1989 was often referred to as the so-called fall of communism after that. And then from there, revolution then spread. It spread to other countries. It went from Poland into Hungary, East Germany, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Romania, etc. At that point, they began to pretty much just overthrow communism in Eastern Europe. You kind of see here kind of images of the Berlin Wall there. Of course, people gathered at the Berlin Wall in November, of course, of 1989. I was in high school at the time when this happened, kind of considered a major event in world history. And so they began to open, of course, the wall at that point. You can see right here. November 9th, I think, is the date when they say that the Berlin Wall fell. So a lot of people think that that's kind of when the Cold War kind of starts to come to an end at that point. So yeah, that whole thing right there really is one of the major events that really leads into the end of the Cold War era. What happens, of course, afterwards, the Berlin Wall, they eventually would get rid of it in 1990. So, you get this reunification of Germany afterwards. There's no more East and West Germany. And so that's really seen as the pivotal thing that really ends the Cold War era at that point. And then a few months later, of course, the thing that happens in December 1991, I think Christmas Day, these are the date they put it at, Soviet Union broke up at that point. It ended, it collapsed at that point. And what happens afterwards is Russia at that point becomes a federation, which is founded in 1991. And that was under President Boris Yeltsin, who's the first president of it. And of course, the current president, is now Vladimir Putin. So yeah, Cold War ended, pretty much 1991 is usually the official date that they usually put it at. I will talk about some other events that were kind of in the Cold War, kind of like what happened after the Cold War ended as well. Yeah, you got a lot of major key events that do happen, like in the post-Cold War era that they talk about. Like you do have the Gulf War or Persian Gulf War that happened. That's a major event that happened in 1990, 91. That occurred when Saddam Hussein, who was the president of Iraq, invaded Kuwait. And so the United States and other countries intervened, of course, in what became known as the Persian Gulf War. And I think it has like different names that they called Operation Desert Storm, of course, was the other name it was called. And we would go on to defeat, of course, what was basically the forces of Saddam Hussein in that war. Also, yeah, that conflict. Also, the breakup of Yugoslavia was another thing that happened as well. It was famous, I guess, after the Cold War. And yeah, Yugoslavia, which was a communist country, it broke up after the Cold War ended. And you get the different countries that kind of separate afterwards. Bosnia-Herzegovina, of course, created out of that. Croatia separates. Slovenia. Serbia breaks up as well. Macedonia also broke up as well. I think it was part of it at one point. But it's now called the Republic of, I want to say North Macedonia. Macedon is what it's called. Albania was kind of not part of that, though, I think, or maybe it was. It kind of broke off and became a separate state. I know that afterwards as well. There's an image of Boris Yeltsin. They did have this coup attempt where hardliners tried to take over the Soviet Union. But that was basically crushed by the Russian military, and that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union afterwards in December 1991. So yeah, Gorbachev, who at one point was president of the Soviet Union, he stepped down. That's like one of the last major events, of course, of the Cold War era that you have. Of course, the current president of Russia is now, a lot of people don't like him now, I guess because of the Ukraine thing. But anyway, of course, the September 11 attacks, that's another major event that happened on September 11th, 2001. Believe it or not, I was in my first semester of teaching when the September 11th attacks happened. That's amazing. That's how long I've been teaching. I've been teaching about 21 years. So I guess everybody knows where they were. Or maybe some of you probably weren't born yet, when the September 11 attacks, of course, happened. Twin Towers, World Trade Center, of course, destroyed by Al-Qaeda using airplanes. So I was considered, of course, that led to the war on terrorism, where the United States went into Iraq and also Afghanistan. So we had that as well involved. Like the Iraq War was another major event where they toppled Saddam Hussein, who they thought was supporting Al-Qaeda, of course, 2003 to 2011. So that was another major event that was part of the post-Cold War era overall. The Great Recession. That was another major event. That was like part of the post-Cold War era as well, where there was an economic downturn, which was caused by, they think, like a housing bubble that burst, which happened around 2007 to about 2009, the Great Recession. I don't know if any of y'all remember that or not. But, and of course, under Obama's administration, they did kill Osama bin Laden. I think that was a major thing that happened in 2011, where they eventually killed him. Looks like May 2011 is what it was, of course. COVID. I think everybody knows that one pretty much. COVID was, of course, another major event, post-Cold War era. 2020, 21, 22, of course. I guess COVID's over. I think it's over pretty much. Of course, dying out anyway. But that was a major, of course, event. And then, of course, currently now, I think the big event that's going on now is the Russia-Ukraine war. You've got that going on, of course, in eastern Ukraine, where Russia's fighting, I guess, the Republic of Ukraine. I guess that's one of our big events now, of course, in the post-Cold War era that we have. So anyway, that wraps up, of course, my Cold War lecture part 2. Of course, I mostly just talked about the major events that happened from the 1960s up to like the fall of collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991.